Welcome back to Obsessed with Assessment podcast, the show in which we delve into the complex world of educational assessment, seeking insights for everyday teaching, life and beyond. My name is Sam Deno and I've been working in education for 15 years, starting as a secondary classroom teacher before moving into educational publishing. My current role is the National Assessment Lead at Twinkle. Now, we've touched on marking bias in a handful of episodes before, but I've been keen to properly explore it for some time. This week, I began sourcing background information and came across some research in the British Journal of Educational Psychology, carried out by Lewis Doyle, Matthew Easterbrook and Peter Harris, that acted as a fabulous summary of the issues that day-to-day teachers face. We're lucky today because instead of having me and Emma report to you what the research says secondhand, I've managed to track down Dr. Lewis Doyle himself, and I'm going to talk to him about his findings in that original research and where he's taken it since then. Lewis is a postdoctoral researcher at the Université de Poitiers. Does that sound all right?
Université de Poitiers.
Better. And a visiting researcher at the University of Sussex. And he has a particular interest in how social psychological processes contribute to educational outcomes and prejudice. He belongs to a group of psychologists calling themselves the School Inclusion Group, who carry out research in order to understand and combat educational inequalities. Welcome to the podcast, Lewis.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to be following the usual format of the show. We'll have about 10 minutes of discussion about Lewis's research, and then we'll round off with some key takeaways of ideas that educators could embed into their day-to-day practice. Lewis, can I ask you then, first of all, what led you to an interest in educational inequality?
I trained as a primary school teacher a while back. So I do have a background in education. And then I also did a master's in psychology. And these two things kind of together started me thinking about issues of kind of fairness and equality in the educational space. And I got reflecting on the fact that during my teacher training, there hadn't really been any kind of input on issues of inequality and fairness in education.
So can you talk us through the 2022 study then, which to give it its full name is called Roles of Socioeconomic Status, Ethnicity and Teacher Beliefs in Academic Grading? What did you set out to achieve and what were the results?
We were aware of some work that had been done in other countries that had demonstrated assessment bias, but we were also aware that very little had been done in the UK. We decided to kind of hone in on socioeconomic status and ethnicity because we were very aware of inequalities in outcomes relating to both of those demographics. And what we did, kind of our methodology, was to give, we had over 400 teachers took part in this online study, and all 400 teachers were asked to read an identical piece of work. And they were told that this piece of work was completed by a student in year 6 who went to a school with average demographics and so on. But the teachers were led to believe that it had been written by a student from differing backgrounds. So if you imagine a quarter of the teachers thought that it was written by a student who was from a higher socioeconomic status and who was white British. A quarter thought that it was written by a white British student from a lower socioeconomic status. A quarter thought that it was written by a Black Caribbean student from higher socioeconomic status. and a quarter thought that it was written by a Black Caribbean student from lower socioeconomic status. And so what we did was we asked teachers to read the work, and after that we asked them to provide certain judgments on that. So firstly, we asked them to give it a grade based on the quality of the work. We asked them to, because it was a year 6 student and they were about to go into year 7, we said, well, what set would you put this student in when they enter year 7 for English? So what we found was that teachers, remember, this is not all teachers, but this is the tendency that we found within the study, was to say that they gave a higher grade to students from a higher socioeconomic status than the lower socioeconomic status student. And that grade difference was about 4.4%. Similarly, with the kind of ability group allocation, they put the higher socioeconomic status student into a higher ability group. They perceived that student to be working at a higher level. And in all of these cases, obviously, the lower socioeconomic status student is the one who suffers, because they, despite having produced exactly the same piece of work, ostensibly, they have been kind of given a biased grade or a biased ability grouping. In terms of ethnicity, we didn't find the same results, and I'm happy to discuss that a bit later if you like. But the main finding was this kind of very apparent socioeconomic bias.
That 4.4% you said there, which is fairly stark. There are probably very few people listening to this show who would be surprised by that. Were you surprised by the results at all?
I think we were perhaps a bit more concerned than surprised. What we see in exam results is that we do see differences between students from higher and lower socioeconomic backgrounds. But what this suggests is that perhaps, obviously there are many factors that are at play that would contribute to that, but perhaps one of those could be that teachers give differential treatment and differential grading to students without knowing it necessarily. I think that's one of the key things to say here, that we don't always know that we're doing this. And obviously, I know as well as anyone that teachers are, they do an amazing job with limited resources under high cognitive load, but they're only human, and that these kinds of biases do affect all of us.
It's a huge question, but what leads us to those socioeconomic biases?
Yeah, it is a huge question.
It's a slightly unfair question.
Well, I think the first thing to mention is that kind of socioeconomic biases we could describe it as a one of many cognitive biases that we have as humans. And we rely on these kind of cognitive biases in our day-to-day lives. Essentially, they're like mental shortcuts that allow us to work and exist more efficiently. They enable us to make quick judgments, so we don't have to always stop and deliberate over every decision that we make in life. These are things kind of that our brain has kind of over time has kind of given us this idea, okay, well, if this happens, then this happens. Or if I see this, then that means this. And so these are kind of examples of cognitive biases. Now, with respect to socioeconomic biases, these would likely develop from a very young age, when we start to kind of see and hear perhaps stereotypical representations of people from different backgrounds. So like this could be through conversations that we either have or overhear kind of within our socialization in childhood, and particularly also through the media representations, media and television and internet. So over time, these kind of stereotypes can become ingrained in our minds, and they develop into biases whereby we kind of begin to expect certain behaviors from people who look or act or speak in a certain way, or people just who we know come from a certain background. And your listeners, as I mentioned, we all know that teachers do an amazing job, and your listeners will know that education is a very high stakes environment for many reasons. But if these biases do emerge, then it can have really detrimental effects on kind of the short and long-term outcomes of students.
Do you have any theories about why those are much less pronounced bias in terms of the racial differences?
For this one, I'd love to say that I don't think racial bias exists in education, but I think that's kind of highly unlikely just because of the nature of the world we live in. But I do think that teachers are more likely to be aware of racial bias, and issues surrounding racism do tend to be more commonly discussed. Whereas kind of this issue of socioeconomic differences and kind of maybe we could call it classism seem to be much less of a taboo topic. I think it's perhaps less frowned upon to make a joke about class differences than it is about race differences, for example. So we speculated that because of this, teachers were kind of perhaps better able to monitor and inhibit racial biases while completing the tasks in the study than they were perhaps about, this kind of socioeconomic bias.
So if there are these unconscious biases, is there anything that you think the teaching community can do to address them?
So I think these are definitely issues that go beyond individuals, and they will obviously require kind of pretty seismic societal shifts to heal. But that doesn't give us as individuals a free pass to do nothing. I think that it's important that we do kind of focus on where these might exist. And research has shown that understanding how these processes influence your practice, and particularly becoming aware of your own biases, is a really essential step to overcoming them. But unfortunately, we are human, and learning about these biases is actually extremely uncomfortable, and does tend to make us feel a bit defensive when we're confronted with these kinds of ideas, because nobody wants to be told that they are racist or classist or homophobic or anything like that. It's a pretty affronting feeling, and we kind of tend to close up when we're giving that. But that's the exact opposite reaction to what we want. What we want is we want to be open to accepting that this is the case and thinking instead about, okay, well, what can I do to change that situation? We kind of use this study and some other studies that we've done in some workshops that we do with teachers and educators and head teachers to kind of share the findings and start getting a discussion going about that. And I think that the more conversations that we have like that, the better. So, it's great to be able to talk to you about this subject today, because I think that it's something that people often really don't want to talk about, but it's a conversation that we do need to have as educators.
Has all this work made you sort of check yourself quite a lot?
Absolutely. It's been uncomfortable work for many, many reasons. Yeah. So throughout this, I reflect on things a lot more than I used to. I do realize where my own biases lie, and I think that there are probably still other biases within me that are yet to be, kind of yet to emerge, but are probably deep down in there somewhere. And I think that admitting that is not an easy thing. Like the first step, even just admitting it to yourself, is not easy, but then admitting it kind of in public, like I am right here, it's it's a challenge, but I think it's something that is actually really, really important for us all to do, just to kind of think about, okay, well, I am a flawed human being. What can I do better? And it's not until you start thinking about those things that you can actually start making a difference. Because otherwise you could go your whole life holding these biases, and like I said, in certain situations, particularly high stakes situations like education or medicine or law or anything like that, it has a big effect. It can have a really serious effect on the people that you're working with.
Yeah. Is that then the main takeaway in terms of what we could communicate to teachers about this piece of research, the research that you do going forwards? Is the main takeaway check yourself?
I think checking yourself is really important. I think trying to make the time and space to do that and just to reflect is essential. I think there are also some kind of more tangible things that you can do, like in terms of trying to mark trying to mark blind, for example, if you don't know the names of the students, or obviously in primary school, actually probably in many school settings, the handwriting, you do start to notice who the students are, and that becomes a giveaway. But blind marking is good. Marking with a rubric has been shown to help as well, so that can kind of help keep assessments objective rather than allowing kind of subjective judgments to creep in. And obviously trying to have low cognitive load, which is much easier said than done in teaching. But I think that is definitely a way that can help. So I guess that's kind of an issue for those higher up to think about how they can support their teachers to have, lower cognitive load, and how they can support them to have the space to have these reflections, and how to have the space to discuss these kinds of things as well in school.
And then the school inclusion group, which is the group that you work as a part of, they offer workshops for schools, am I right in saying? And how can those be accessed?
Yeah, so so I've been doing some work with the school inclusion group. It's led by a couple of my colleagues at the University of Sussex, and essentially what they tend to do is work with specific schools to identify groups of students who might be struggling, and trying to identify some of the kind of psychological processes that might be contributing to those struggles. So that could be, for example, that students perceive bias from their teachers, but it could be other things as well. So it's kind of very context specific, because you might have perceptions of bias in some schools and not in others. And then what we do is we kind of work with those schools to kind of maybe make a few little adjustments, and kind of come up with a plan of how we're going to kind of change things, to kind of make these environments perhaps less threatening and more inclusive and supportive to those students. And then kind of follow up to see if there have been changes. So if people are interested, you can go to our website, which is www.schoolinclusion.org.uk. And there is a contact us form on there if anyone's interested.
That sounds brilliant. That sounds like it would be really useful for schools. Well, this has been really fascinating, Lewis. Thank you so much for sharing these amazing insights with me and with the audience. It's really enlightening and a lot of food for thought for everybody. That's it for another episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this issue. Please email us at assessment@twinkle.co.uk with any reflections. You can reach me by searching for Sam Deno on Blue Sky. Please say hello. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.